G'day and welcome back to A Kiwi's Perspective. Today we're going to be covering the recent activity taking place by our New Zealand police force deciding that it is their responsibility to regulate freedom of speech online. For those who aren't quite in the know, we're going to go over a couple of clips regarding a recent post that went semi-viral within New Zealand that was inferring that the new trade agreement done with India is now going to unleash a wave of mass immigration, which are having impacts across communities today. Now, no matter how you feel about the post at hand and whether it was done in bad taste or something you wouldn't like, I believe that most Kiwis understand that comes with a society that has freedom of speech, the most vital aspect of a genuine democracy. So let's jump in, shall we? We're going to go over some clips today, and we're going to break down what this could mean for New Zealand moving forward. Make sure to like and follow or subscribe if you're viewing this on YouTube, as the more support that we get through these videos, the more that we'll be able to do in the future. And as I've stated multiple times on this show, our goal is to propel conversation and to get more people thinking about the decisions that they make, particularly when voting. So let's jump right in, shall we? We're going to start with the platform and we'll go from there.
A story that broke this week after a young woman called Renee Rose Schwenk posted on her social media a picture of her sitting in a cafe with an Indian guy in a turban behind her and another Indian guy, and it said, "Welcome to New India. Thanks to," something along the lines of, "thanks to Prime Minister Chris Singh, S-I-N-G-H. Now, okay, you might think that's in bad taste. Other people might not like it. Don't read it. Move on. Scroll down. And one would have thought that was the end of it. But she got a bit of a pile on social media. And then people figured out who she was and where her mum's business was in Whitianga. And people started piling on the business. So Avis, you know what this is about. But then the police rang her mother in Whitianga and said they wanted to find Renee because they'd had a complaint about her. Now, Renee and her mum were already planning to go down to the Whitianga police station to talk about the trolling that was going on. But they get put in a room with a sergeant, not a senior sergeant as I understand, who tells them the tweet's very questionable and they are not being welcoming and it could be racist and tut. And they basically look at it and say, well, what are you going to do about it? He leaves the room and it all seems to be over. But many people concerned, particularly when they watch where Britain has gone to, that we had a case of the policing Facebook and social media.
So before we get into Mark Mitchell's response, who is the head of New Zealand Police at the moment, I just wanted to break down that a little bit more before we move forward. So as just laid out for us, there was a post that received quite a lot of attention. And it might have been a lot more than she was expecting. But that's the reality of social media, is that once it's out there for everybody. And I've definitely experienced this since starting this page and channel. There can be some very vocal voices that have a lot to say and say in particular ways that I wouldn't really expect from an in-person interaction. This can go as far as death threats, which I'm not 100% if that's what this led to, but I would imagine if you are going to go to get the police involved regarding threats, that they would be to that level of trolling, quote unquote. Now, as of now, nothing has really come of this thus far. And to a lot of people, that might mean that we don't have to worry about it. But as we're going to break down here, that's not the case. And everyone should be actively paying attention to the space moving forward. So, Let's see what Mark Mitchell's response was, which, to be fair, he also did go onto the show, and I'll be linking all the links as I usually do to these clips below, and I recommend you get the full context. But let's just read out Mark Mitchell's official statement that he put on his Facebook and his Twitter page. Yesterday, I sought more information from police on the action taken in response to a social post. Whilst the post did not meet the police threshold for further inquiry, it was forwarded to staff in Whitianga for follow-up. What was done in a professional way with a local lens around social cohesion. I accept the inquiry was made in good faith and was well intentioned, but it did not meet police's own threshold for further inquiry and should not have been forwarded to them for follow-up. Police acknowledge this and are clear that people have every right to exercise their freedom of speech. We do not have hate speech laws in New Zealand. Hate speech laws, and New Zealanders don't want to live in a country where speech is policed. Our law does provide for offences where threatening, abusive, or intimidating behaviour is intended to incite hostility, violence, or serious harm against others, which includes both race and religion. Overt racism that crosses that line has no place in our society, and where conduct breaches the law, people should be held accountable for these actions. It is my expectation the police continue to enforce the law where that threshold is met. Our police should be acknowledged for the outstanding work they do on law and order and keeping New Zealanders safe. They dedicate themselves to protect hundreds of events every year so that people can exercise their freedom of speech whilst trying to keep everyone safe. So that's Mark Mitchell's response, and it's a pretty standard response that you expect from a politician. What I would point out to that response, which I actually commented on asking for this follow-up, was what are the steps that are going to be taken to address the matter at hand? That taxpayer dollars were used to try regulate a person's freedom of speech. That's essentially what happened here. And because they pushed back, nothing came of it. But that wasn't the intention when they had that meeting, or else it would have never been brought up in the first place, and they would have just focused on the threats that had been sent to the individual who made the post. This is a very slippery slope. And the fact that Mark Mitchell hasn't outlined the steps that will be taken to avoid this in the future and the consequences for those involved for how this was handled is quite worrying to me. He broke down where police should be and where their focus should be and how great they are. And to be fair, most of them are, 100%. But a few bad apples ruin the basket. We all know that. And what is going to happen moving forward to stop this taking place? And I believe that there's a real reason why that wasn't outlined in this response. So let's dive in to some previous behaviour suggesting that not only are the police doing this on a regular basis, but also that this is the plan moving forward. Just because we don't have things written down in our law doesn't mean that those with power try to enforce what they believe is right, even if not outlined or given permission by the government. Without a ratified constitution that secures our Bill of Rights, what we have is not fundamentally protected. So let's jump in to a little bit more of background of what's been taking place.
The Free Speech Union had a bit of a campaign because under, was it the Official Information Act or something? Yeah, I think it was. They noticed that New Zealand Police, and this was prior to the change in government, under Commissioner Costa of the time, were involved in receiving compulsory training designed to help them detect hate speech and hate crimes. And if you remember rightly, I said my son got involved in that, remember? As a prank. He suddenly was investigated for a hate crime. This last year when he was being stupid. Anyhow, the examples of such offences in the compulsory training that the police receive included training material that included the statements, for example, there are only two genders. So if you wanted to say you're male or female, apparently you were guilty, according to the police training, of committing a hate crime. A ditto Kiwi, not iwi, was given as an example of a hate crime. And perhaps most perplexing of all, noted the Free Speech Union, free speech was designated as a hate crime or hate speech by the police in their training. Now, we all thought that this would be fine, it would be all going at the last election, that the new police minister would stop this kind of nonsense, and that with the move sideways of Commissioner Costa, that the police wouldn't be so stupid after all and would actually go out there and do the job that they're paid to do. Well, the Free Speech Union have bad news on that front, and joining us to tell us about it is their spokesperson, Nathan Saulu, and he joins us now. Nathan, welcome to the show again. Nice to have you on.
Yeah, great to see you. Thanks for having me.
What's the story? I thought all this was over.
So did we. Look, you said in the opening that it was through an OIA we discovered this training. It actually wasn't. It was actually from within the police that concerned officers.
You got it leaked to you by a policeman.
Yeah. And we were only able to attain screenshots of the training, so we weren't able to get the training in full. That's what really started us looking into this, and the fact that police were being instructed to recognize, record, and respond to perceived hate crime and hate speech. Now, as many of your listeners will be fully aware, we fought back against hate speech laws successfully, thanks to the supporters of the Free Speech Union and many listeners of this show. And what actually has happened here is the police have gone out ahead of government and have continued to do this work, despite not necessarily being instructed to do so.
So that's an example there of just a bit of context that the police have been preparing for this for a while. That clip, I believe, is over a year old. And there are reports going as far back as when Jacinda was running the show that police were taking on UK-style training to regulate online content that could be deemed as hate speech. To be fair, in the UK, hate speech is now defined in law. New Zealand, luckily, doesn't have that yet. But I wanted to point that clip out to you because, as outlined by Mark Mitchell, there was no real way to address this. Police had been trained to do what happened to this girl. And no matter how you feel about the post, whether it was in bad taste or racist or however you view it, you either fundamentally agree that people have the right to express their views and opinions that don't violate people's safety, or you don't. And you believe that the government should step in the way to protect people from essentially hurt feelings. As was outlined in that clip, some of the examples had to do with gender and even the term free speech. How ambiguous is that? And that's the whole point of this being abstract, is that it can be malleably applied to whatever they deem necessary, so then they can enforce the standards, quote unquote, that they want on the people. A lot of people think that this is not so big of an issue. This is an outlier and it's not something to be worried about. But when the Bill of Rights can be overturned by a simple majority in Parliament, so just so we're absolutely clear, a simple majority means one vote over 50%. And if you have that in your Parliament, you can then amend the Bill of Rights, which requires no consultation, which requires no referendum from the people. Just so we're absolutely clear, internationally, that's not considered a right. most democracies have ratified constitutions that have things in place. For example, in Switzerland, if they want to amend their constitution, they need 75% of parliament to agree it needs to happen. And then it must go to referendum before it's passed. That is the standard. In New Zealand, it's far easier, far more malleable. And what we can see now is we have a bureaucracy that has plagued the police to continue to enforce these habits and enforce this training, despite the current government, at least they're claiming, that they're against this. Where does that leave New Zealand as a society? Freedom of speech is the most valuable asset of a democracy. It is the only way a democracy can operate. The marketplace of ideas is how people figure out what's right and wrong. And if somebody thinks they're wrong, it's usually because they've been convinced otherwise. And if we're banned from having those conversations because the topic is considered niche or offensive in the eyes of the governing force, that is a very steep slope that leads towards a 1984 style government. That might seem a little bit extreme, but as we're going to look into now, we're going to be covering a couple clips regarding what's taking place in the UK right now, in which our law is based on, who have stronger laws in place to defend what they consider their freedoms. So let's jump in, shall we?
This is a story from The Telegraph about the 30 arrests a day that are being made for online messages. The police are making 30 arrests a day for offensive posts on social media and other platforms. Thousands of people are being detained and questioned for sending messages that cause annoyance or inconvenience or anxiety to others via the internet, telephone or mail. Custody data obtained by The Times shows that officers are making about 12,000 arrests a year under Section 127 of the Communications Act in 2003. The Act makes it illegal to cause distress by sending grossly offensive messages. I suppose that more power that's afforded to the institutions of government and power, the more likely it is that they'll use their own discernment to criminalise people based on convenience. And increasingly what you'll see is views that are unpopular or voices that are effective being marginalised and criminalised.
So feel free to verify those claims. But anyone who's been paying attention already knows that's true. The UK has more arrests taken place for online content than Russia. It astounds me. The birthplace of freedom of speech that push these values across the world are now arresting people based on being offensive. You have to be able to risk being offensive in order to think. That is how it works. Everyone has their own triggers. Everyone is malleable. And if you start drawing lines in the sand of what's okay and what's not okay, you start to take away, piece by piece, what is allowed within a society. Most people would argue the market ideas does that themselves. Generally speaking today, if you're an open racist, people don't want to associate with you. That's just how it operates. If you're proven to be a genuine bigot, people don't want to work with you. If you take stands that are so far out there that the market doesn't agree with, you will be isolated. Society already does that. And the problem with that is most revolutionary ideas start as fringe. Most people who push for genuine change, which is positive to a community and larger society, tend to be shouted down and try to be removed. And if it turns out that what they're trying to push is genuinely harmful, eventually the market of ideas pushes them out. But if the government steps in and they start making those decisions, and the police start enforcing what's okay and what's not okay, then you start to see societies that are run on controlling thought, where, say, in China, if you disagree with the ruling one-party system, you can very likely be removed from your job, if not worse. How in the Soviet Union, even whispers of you being disloyal would end up with you and your family either in slavery or dead. And we take that for granted, especially in the West. Most of us have lived with freedom of speech for over 100 years now. It is something that we treasure, but yet so easily toss aside as just an industry standard that we don't need to think about, that we don't need to protect. But it is being attacked every single day. We have seen that now in our own society. We are watching people across the world being removed either through jail, through being pushed out, or disappearing because they present views that challenge what is considered the traditional outlook. It is a very scary time because we wouldn't even really need to be discussing this 20 years ago. And yet here we are seeing blatant examples within our communities of freedom of speech being infringed. And New Zealand has no function to protect that. Not ultimately. If there's too much pushback, they won't force it through. Which, thank God for people like the Free Speech Union who are keeping things at bay. But that doesn't mean they're going to stop. Regulating thought is the ultimate goal for those who have complete control. They want your loyalty and they want you to align, and they don't want you to challenge. They want you to be subservient. And that is where we're starting to head now. As we've just seen, police are being trained to regulate freedom of speech online. Despite that not being a law within New Zealand, the bureaucracy that has been hijacked is pushing through agendas that, may I point out, align with globalist interests to take away the individual's rights that we've held on to so dearly. And where does this lead to? Well, we've got one more clip for you today. A clip regarding another major step that the UK has taken and how they handle a lot of these arrests that have now piled up because of how much offensive content is leading people towards jail. So let's jump into this last clip, shall we?
David Lammy is set to scrap jury trials and remove your automatic right to appeal. Juries will only hear cases of murder, rape and manslaughter. Now, think about what this means practically. Take the case of Jamie Michael. Labour Party staff members reported him to police for a video he did about illegal immigration. He was charged, he went to court, a jury found him not guilty in just 17 minutes. But what if only the judge had heard that case? We hear a lot about left-wing activist judges, and now they may be given even more power. 75% of all cases will be heard by a single judge, so they can sentence you to anything up to 5 years, and you could lose your automatic right to appeal that decision. This is really sinister. And the head of the Criminal Bar Association said Lammy was about to, quote, destroy a criminal justice system that's been the pride of this country for centuries, and to destroy justice as we know it. Well, earlier on, I caught up with Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick. Now by the Shadow Justice Secretary, Robert Jenrick. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. So that's David Lammy's plan to clear the backlog. What would yours be then?
Well, look, firstly, David Lammy used to be a strong proponent of jury trials, and now he's in office, he's scrapping them, all bar the most, rarest cases, all for fixing an abject failure in the administration of the courts that's led to this massive backlog. There is a different way to handle this situation without getting rid of our most ancient liberties, a pillar of our constitution. Get the court sitting around the clock, as David Lammy himself used to advocate. And as it happens, the Lady Chief Justice, the most senior person in our judiciary, was actually in Parliament today telling MPs that there are more courts that could be sitting, there are more sitting days, and she's offered the government this solution. They've rejected it on cost ground, and instead of actually doing that, getting on with the hard yards of governing, David Lammy is ripping up this ancient part of our constitution.
So I left that little bit towards the end in, and as I said, you can look at these full interviews. I'll be linking them in the description. But I wanted to point out there how the justifications being put forward are not the reasons why they're doing that. Let's be absolutely clear. A pair of your juries, the jury being of your peers, is how they make sure that people are being trialed justly. It doesn't always work, don't get me wrong, no system's perfect. But to leave the decision down to a singular individual that could impact somebody's life forever, up to 5 years is just the beginning. Once things are on your record, it can make everything a hell of a lot harder. And the UK are removing juries. Up to 75% of all court cases moving forward. That is insane. But it's happening. And the government can just do it, despite massive pushback from those they claim to represent. What's stopping that from happening in New Zealand? The UK has more laws in place to protect their citizens than New Zealand does. Our constitutional law is so malleable it can be changed by a random tribunal, and is now leading to a full-blown separatist movement taking place within the country where people are advocating to divide us on race. You don't need to know a lot about history to know that's a bad idea. And we are heading down that path. We are seeing police officers regulating online content, despite not even having the laws in place to let them do so, to try and intimidate people to act accordingly. We are seeing this training taking place despite members of government claiming that it shouldn't be happening. We have our, pretty much where our laws come from, the UK, heading down a dark totalitarian path which has a government ID attached to a digital ID to manage everything from your passport to your finances, for your ability to seek medical care, and everything in between, as well as juries being taken off you and people being arrested for offensive content online. How do we even deem offensive? Do we ask every single person? Or is it just a malleable structure being put in place so that those in power can control the thoughts of the masses? This is dangerous. We have taken what we have for granted. It is scary how many people are just following suit. This is the way forward. The government should step in at every opportunity so that people don't get hurt. And don't get me wrong, we don't want people physically getting hurt, which is why freedom of speech already doesn't cover inciting violence. We understand that. That's why it's written down. Nobody here is talking about old Joe Bill calling for the eradication of Māori, or the massive amount of anti-Semites calling for the exterminations of Jews. Or, on the other side, the people supporting complete and utter destruction of Palestine, calling for those people to die. We don't cover those things under freedom of speech. What we do cover is opinions. What we do cover is thoughts that could be deemed offensive. And what we're seeing now is a bureaucracy class that has been hijacked by global interests enforcing the new standards across our country. And it has started in our universities and it has now infiltrated our police force. And I can pretty much guarantee you now that once people who are savvy within law are no longer involved in Parliament, it will continue to erode until the Bill of Rights is pretty much thrown out. That is the trajectory we're on. It is not hard to see these patterns, and all we have to do is look overseas to see how that is impacting those societies that are already further down the path than we are. We as a nation need to stand up against this. And to be honest, I don't really see this fight stopping until we have a ratified constitution that secures our Bill of Rights so that referendum is required for that to be changed. So that if you're pulled over by a police officer, you have access to a document that outlines how they need to operate when interacting with you. And if they fail to follow those standards, not only does that make whatever they're trying to do to you null and void, but can also get the police officer in trouble for infringing your rights. But we don't have that in this country. It took till 1991 for the Bill of Rights to get put into law. And as I said earlier, it can be changed by a simple majority within Parliament. They don't even have to consult the people and go to referendum. That means that a coalition government or a single party that gets a majority can campaign on one thing and then rip everything out. And how much damage can be done in 3 years? What happens if a government comes in, war starts overseas, they postpone elections like they've done in Ukraine, and suddenly we're not allowed to interact with our own government to hold them accountable? We're not quite there yet, and that's what gives me hope. But the reality is that we're stepping towards this, and that's what this is. And anyone who thinks otherwise is ignorant to the trends that are taking place all across the world. Even in the United States, who arguably have the strongest protection for their First Amendment, are now seeing infringements take place as those who criticize Israel can have their green cards removed and can be prosecuted for anti-Semitic views. Those things are happening right now, as you've seen in some of these clips, and I highly recommend you deep dive, particularly into the UK, as that's what most relates to us, but it's all over the West this is taking place. And those who aren't rejecting it are giving away the fundamental freedoms that our ancestors died for. And as I said, I don't see this changing without a ratified constitution. And hopefully one day there's a party that will stand up and campaign for that. It would help put the treaty to bed. It can be incorporated and ratified and defined so it's not constantly changed over the decades to suit those who are in power at the time to divide and conquer the people, which is what's taking place right now. This is a warning to New Zealand that this is what we're expecting moving forward if nothing changes. And just to point out, this is while National are in government. Those who are considered the more conservative, traditional people that you would expect to be more aggressively securing these rights. I really want to put that in your guys' head today. That actually what we're seeing now is a trend and it's continuing. And if we don't stand up now, we will lose everything. Thank you very much for watching today's episode. If you've made it this far, please follow the page. Subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Like, comment. If you disagree with me, I want to hear it. To be honest, if you're just going to be throwing, slurs and insults, I'm going to have fun and reply back to try to get you to block me, because that's always good fun. It helps propel the growth of the channel. But if you genuinely disagree with me, I would love to hear why. As is the whole point of this channel, is to start these conversations. Something that we might not be able to allow to do for much longer. But anyway, thank you for your time, and we'll see you later on A Kiwi's Perspective.